Hello everyone. In this mini lecture we are going to discuss the diencephalon. In previous lectures before spring break we had discussed the cerebrum, and we're now working our way inferiorly through the rest of the brain. So you can see the diencephalon shown in green on the diagram. It's located basically at the center or the core of the brain. And there's several different several specific parts that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about the thalamus, the hypothalamus, including the infundibulum, the mammillary bodies, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. As with the cerebrum, a lot of brain function is very diffuse, or a single structure might be involved with a number of different functions. So we're really going to just discuss kind of either the basics or the most clear-cut and well-defined portions of diencephalon function. In order to understand some of the terminology and descriptions of diencephalon function, we need to introduce some terminology that's associated with the flow of information through the spinal cord up to the brain, and from the brain down through the spinal cord. So sensory information that's gathered from around the body, for example, if somebody were to touch the shoulder, that information travels through a peripheral nerve to the spinal cord, and then it travels up the spinal cord towards the brain, and it's traveling through spinal cord white matter as it does so. Because this information is traveling in an upward direction, the nervous system structures that are conducting these nerve impulses are referred to as ascending structures. The information is referred to as ascending information. The electrical impulse could be called an ascending impulse, and these travel through what would be called ascending tracts or pathways. So when we hear the word ascending being used in the context of the central nervous system, we're typically referring to sensory information that's traveling in an upward direction, either from the spinal cord up into the lower parts of the brain, or through the lower parts of the brain up towards the cerebrum. On the other hand, when the central nervous system produces motor commands or motor responses, let's say in response to being touched on the shoulder, you were going to swat something away by contracting the muscles in your arm. The central nervous system is going to send a motor command down the spinal cord, where it will then exit the spinal cord and pass through peripheral nerves to stimulate an effector such as a muscle. Because the electrical impulse or the action potential is traveling in a downward direction, it can be referred to as descending information or a descending impulse, and it's going to be passing through white matter that is referred to as a descending tract or a descending pathway. So when you hear the term descending in the context of the central nervous system, it's referring to motor information traveling through motor neurons that are carrying information generally in a downward direction. So let's go on and discuss the first structure of the diencephalon. The first structure we're going to talk about is the thalamus. It's located here on either side of the third ventricle. And one function of the thalamus is that it is the location of synapses for ascending sensory information that's going to pass up to the cerebral cortex. So imagine you have a neuron that's coming up through the spinal cord, and it's carrying somatic sensory information that you're going to become consciously aware of. That neuron passes through the brainstem without stopping, and then enters the thalamus. And then here in the thalamus, it synapses with another neuron that will then carry that information to the appropriate part of the cerebral cortex. For example, it might synapse with a neuron in the thalamus that will then direct that impulse to the specific part of the somatosensory homunculus so you can become aware of what part of your body is being touched. And so if you were stepped on something sharp, the impulse might go to that part of your cerebral cortex. But let's say you bumped your knee or you bumped your elbow, then that information would come up and be sent to a different part of your cerebral cortex. And so the thalamus, to some extent, edits, filters, and directs sensory information that's heading to the cerebral cortex. When we describe it as editing information, what that's referring to is that sometimes the impulse or the information that's traveling up comes to the thalamus but is not relayed on. For one reason or another, the impulse will stop there. Right? How and why that might happen is a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to do in the course, but just know that that is a particular option. The thalamus is also associated with the limbic system. The limbic system is a collection of brain structures that are involved with emotional response and mood modification and regulation. And so there are specific nuclei, in other words, patches of gray matter associated with the thalamus that are involved with the limbic system. Moving to the next structure of the diencephalon, we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a mass of tissue located on the posterior portion of the diencephalon, and it, among other things, produces a chemical known as melatonin, and there's a lot of evidence that the pineal gland is involved with sleep-wake cycles, as well as other physiological rhythms or physiological cycles, sometimes known as circadian rhythms, that occur over a typical day. For example, there are certain times of the day where our body temperature naturally rises or falls, or our blood pressure rises or falls. And these daily rhythms are to some extent involved with and mediated by the pineal gland. The next structure of the diencephalon that we're going to discuss is the hypothalamus. The term hypo means below or lower, and so it is located somewhat below the thalamus, right? There where I'm pointing on the diagram. And the hypothalamus has a number of nuclei that are involved with a wide range of functions that are largely involved with homeostasis, such as the maintenance of blood pressure, the regulation of body temperature, water and electrolyte balance through regulating our sense of thirst and through regulating our urine output. It's also involved with our sense of hunger or being full, which is called satiation, certain motor aspects of digestive function. It's involved with growth and development, reproduction, sexual development, sexual behavior. And so it's involved with a wide range of things, some of which you are not consciously aware of. Other things such as moods and sex drive and hunger that are very basal urges or drives that you are aware of. Right? There's a reference slide, and it also links to the nervous system with the endocrine system through the pituitary gland. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail shortly. But I was getting ready to say there's a reference slide in the slideshow that gives just some more details on the different parts of the thalamus and some of the specific functions that they're associated with. This goes a little bit beyond the level of detail that we're looking for in the course, but it's here for your reference, and it's worth looking at just to get a sense of kind of the range of things that the hypothalamus is involved with and kind of the complexity of its function. So let's now look at the pituitary gland, which is also sometimes called the hypophysis. So the pituitary gland has a close anatomical relationship with the hypothalamus. So if we start over here on the left side of the screen, just for reference, we're going to be looking at this area here, right? We have the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, and if we zoom in, we can see the hypothalamus, right? We can see the hypothalamus here, right? And then we can see the pituitary gland down here, okay? Notice that the pituitary gland is divided into two parts, an anterior pituitary gland, like that, and a posterior pituitary gland. And these portions of the pituitary are distinct in their function, right? The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through a thin stalk of material known as the infundibulum. Right? So the infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. Let's take a look at the functional relationship that's going to be happening. So the pituitary gland is sometimes known as the master gland because it releases hormones that regulate many other glands in the body. For example, the anterior pituitary gland releases follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which stimulates function in the testes and the ovaries. It produces growth hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropin, also known as ACTH, and thyroid-stimulating hormone. Whereas the posterior pituitary gland, some of the key hormones there is the antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, and oxytocin. Right? What you can get a glimpse at here when you look at the image is that you can see there are neurons in the hypothalamus that are going to either extend to blood vessels, in this case, or directly down to the posterior pituitary gland in that case. And so let's take a look at the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and the neurons that are in the hypothalamus. We're going to start with the posterior pituitary gland first because this situation is just a little bit simpler. And so if you look at the image, we have the posterior pituitary gland on our left, right? And up here, we have a collection of cells that are up in the hypothalamus. Right? These neurons, which are located in the hypothalamus, their cell bodies are in the hypothalamus. Right? The cell bodies are these little stellate structures right there. But you'll notice their axons, or their fibers, extend through the infundibulum. And then the ends of the axons, where the synaptic knobs are, those synaptic knobs are down here in the posterior pituitary gland. And what happens is that when these neurons are stimulated, the synaptic knobs release chemicals, which we would normally refer to as neurotransmitters. But instead of stimulating a nearby cell through the interstitial fluid, what the chemicals released by these synaptic knobs do is they enter into these blood vessels of the posterior pituitary gland, and then they're carried away by the blood. Because the chemicals that are released by these neurons enter into blood and are carried widely through the body through the cardiovascular system to stimulate cells that are far removed from the posterior pituitary gland, the chemicals released by these neurons are technically referred to as hormones. Right? And so we have a kind of an unusual situation where a neuron is releasing a hormone. And the two primary examples are antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Vasopressin, you gotta remember how to spell. Sometimes abbreviated ADH, and oxytocin, which is involved with stimulating mammary glands and the uterus at various points during and after pregnancy. If we look at the anterior pituitary gland, the functional relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is a little bit more complex. We still have a set of neurons whose cell bodies are located in the hypothalamus. Right? But in this case, what happens is their axons are relatively short and they don't really leave the hypothalamus. And what will happen is when these neurons are stimulated, they will again release chemicals into blood. And so you have another unusual circumstance where neurons, instead of releasing neurotransmitters that stimulate other cells directly, they're releasing chemicals that enter into blood and therefore are referred to as hormones. The hormones released by these neurons enter these capillaries and travel through the infundibulum through a blood vessel known as the hypophyseal portal vein. A portal vein is a vein that lies between two different capillary beds. And so we can see the first capillary bed at the hypothalamus, and we can see the second capillary bed down in the anterior pituitary gland. And so these hormones travel through the portal vein into the blood or into the capillary network of the anterior pituitary, where then those hormones diffuse out of the capillaries and stimulate a second set of cells, these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary gland. In response to the hormones of the hypothalamus, the endocrine cells will release their own set of hormones that then travel out of the pituitary gland through venous blood flow to be distributed widely throughout the body and causing changes in cells and tissues that are far removed from the pituitary gland itself. Some good examples of this are gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is released by the hypothalamus, right? And gonadotropin-releasing hormone would travel to the anterior pituitary gland, where it would then cause the anterior pituitary gland to release luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, right, which is from the anterior pituitary. Right? Another example of this kind of cascade of hormones would be the hypothalamus releasing corticotropin-releasing hormone, which would then cause the anterior pituitary gland to release ACTH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland to release hormones such as cortisol. And lastly, we have the mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies are a pair of knob-like or nub-like structures located on the inferior surface of the diencephalon. You can see them externally if you look at the brain in inferior view. And they're involved with processing olfactory information. The term olfactory refers to your sense of smell. Right? Oops. Change colors there. Your sense of smell, as well as linking smells with different memories, associations, and emotional responses. So that brings us to the end of the diencephalon. The next mini lecture will cover the brainstem and the cerebellum.